Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm Kara Cookson. I'm with the Office of the Maine Attorney General. I'm the Victim Witness Advocate Coordinator, and today we have Domestic Violence 101 with Kelly O'Connor and Regina Rooney from the Maine Coalition to End Domestic Violence. This is one of a series of foundational training videos that's intended to give a foundational level of information and skill development. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, Kelly and Regina, for being here today. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Kara. Welcome, everyone. I'm so happy to be with you all today. As Kara said, my name is Kelly O'Connor, and my pronouns are she, her, and I am the System Advocacy and Training Coordinator at the Maine Coalition to End Domestic Violence, or MCEDV, as you will hear referred to throughout the training. Just a quick background about me. Prior to joining MCEDV almost a year ago, I worked with the local Domestic Violence Resource Center, New Hope for Women in the Mid-Coast area, and I did direct service and advocacy work and training and education in the Mid-Coast area for a number of years before transitioning to the coalition. So I'm very happy to be here with you all today. I will be the primary trainer and working you through lots of different activities and content delivery. As Kara said, we really do hope that you're going to be as interactive as possible. It's going to actually be very critical for one of the activities that we have coming up, which I'm going to describe right now briefly, just to give you sort of a sense of what to expect. We're going to be doing something called the skit, and this is what we will need from you all to participate. What the ask will be is for you to read one sentence, maybe two, depending on how many folks volunteer, but truly you will just unmute and read a sentence and then put yourself back on mute. That is all we're asking. It's not something crazy. So I am gonna, Regina is going to be asking you all to message her or put it in the chat in a moment, like, yes, I volunteer, and she is going to assign a number for you all. And that is going to be the number that you're going to read off whenever that pops up on the screen. So just want to be transparent about what the ask is for that activity. I also just want to preface that this training and this content area is something that impacts us all, not just professionally, but often personally. It is an area of, this public health issue, domestic abuse and violence, is extremely prevalent, and we're going to be talking about that. So I always take the opportunity to just let you all know to take care of yourselves as best as you are able to when we talk about this material that may be trauma reminding for yourself. You may have people in your life that you know have experienced domestic abuse and violence. And so we also just want people to be cognizant of the questions they ask and the comments they make, because it's likely that there are survivors or friends of survivors in this Zoom room right now. And so I'm going to hand it over to Regina for a moment to introduce herself and to also talk about her role today.
Thank you, Kelly. Hello, everyone. My name is Regina Rooney. I use she and her pronouns as well, and I'm the Education and Communications Director at MCEDV. It's really fun for me to sort of be Kelly's assistant in these trainings because it feels so far removed for me these days now that Kelly's on our team. But I've been with the coalition almost 8 years now, and previous to that, I spent 3 years working at the local program in Penobscot County, now called Partners for Peace. So I too have that direct local connection and that experience of what it is like to answer helpline calls, to help folks fill out PFAs. And so really try to bring that information and that experience, as distant as it is at this point, to my work at the coalition. And I'm just really pleased to have the opportunity to be here with you all today. As Kelly said, if you're willing to volunteer, please just drop that in the chat now. I have a feeling that I'm going to have to assign you 2 numbers because we need 17 volunteers. We have like 13 people on the call. I can do basic math, right? So it'll be really helpful if you just signal that you're willing to do that so that I can get that all done and set up now. I don't want to just assign it and then have you be a person who's like run to the bathroom and not know that we asked, signed you up for a thing. So please do opt in there in the chat. Thank you so much for folks. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Regina. So I'm going to get the PowerPoint pulled up, but while I'm doing so, I would like to ask you all to pop in the chat where you work and the name of your position and the number of years that you've been working in that capacity. So where you work, which district, which office you work out of again, and your name of your position and the number of years that you've been operating in that capacity. And give me just a second, I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint. All right, and now I'm also going to get my own screen organized on my end so that I can see all the things and see as many of your faces as possible. All right. All righty. I think I'm in good shape now. All right. So this is just a brief overview of the sort of flow of the session today. We're breaking it down into 4 sections. The first part is very foundational. We're really going to be talking about what is domestic abuse and violence, how we define it within the advocacy world, and also talking about prevalence and who is impacted and who is disproportionately impacted. Then we're going to do the skit, as I said, and we're going to look at the sort of messaging that victim survivors receive on a constant basis from people in their lives and systems in their lives. And then we're going to talk about how do we center victim and survivor safety, both in our professional capacity, but also as private citizens. And then we're going to start to talk about a trauma-informed approach through this lens of a coordinated community response. And what does that look like? And how does a coordinated community response, an effective one, really take on, in many ways, elements of a trauma-informed approach? And then look at ways in which you can incorporate a trauma-informed lens to your work with victim survivors and within the criminal legal system. So I'm seeing in the chat that we've got folks that work in like community-based advocacy, domestic violence advocacy services, also within various district attorneys' offices as VWAs. I believe I'm seeing too some staff attorney with Caring Unlimited, welcome. And the Immigrant Resource Center is here as well, which is exciting. So we've got a good range of folks that are on the call with us today, which will hopefully yield a really productive conversation. I just want to recognize too that this is very foundational, as Kara had said, meant to be, very top line. We could talk about domestic abuse and violence for many, many hours and many, many days and not even scratch the surface. So we've got 2 hours together. So just understand that that's where we are currently. So let's get right into it. Before we begin, and I give you the definition that we operate with, I'd like to ask you all to either unmute or pop in the chat, but if you unmute, I think it would be more productive for the recording purposes of this session. How do you define domestic abuse and violence? What is it? Please don't be shy. This is just a safe training space, I promise.
Here, I'll take a swing at it.
Great. Thanks, Matthew. How would you define it?
Quick caveat, I find domestic violence like really hard to define. I know it has a definition, but I think domestic violence can be so many things. It's really hard to kind of put it in a box, but I kind of view it as any sort of, not to use the word in its definition, but any sort of violence that happens like within a home context, and home can mean a lot of different things, but like that's how I also see it as like a pattern of, but it also can be just single instances.
I really appreciate you pointing out pattern, because we're going to be talking about that. That's really important. And that is actually a key component of how we define domestic abuse and violence. and not single instances, actually. And we're going to talk a little bit about that and sort of the distinguishing between sort of the criminal legal definition and the various definitions based on statute, and then how we define it within the advocacy world. I also see that Amy has pointed out that it's family or sexual partners who become assaultive. So focusing on sort of the type of relationship being really critical in terms of defining what DV, domestic violence, is. And also identifying sort of the physical violence that is indicated in Maine statute. So let's talk about this. At MCEDV and within the member programs, we use sort of a 5-point definition to give a very comprehensive definition of what domestic abuse and violence is and what we're talking about. And so as Matthew pointed out, it is part of a pattern, and this is so critical. We are not talking about isolated incidents of physical violence. What we are talking about is a pattern of coercive and controlling behavior, which may include physical violence, but it also may not. You all have pointed out very accurately that the context of the relationship matters. So we are talking about a current or former relationship. Most often, this is an intimate partner relationship. However, it can also include intrafamilial relationships. For the purposes of this training, we are going to focus a little bit more on intimate partner relationships, but just know that a lot of this can also translate, again, into the intrafamilial relationships as well. This third piece here, the key word that you want to tease out is fear. What we're really talking about is when there is this imbalance of power and one person is really using that imbalance of power to create fear in their target and their victim. That's really important. This fourth part of the definition is often hard to swallow, particularly for victim survivors. So when you think about intentionality and why does domestic abuse and violence happen? And we're going to talk about that in a minute. But this is purposeful and chosen behavior. It is not something that is out of control. And we're going to kind of tease apart some of those common justifications for why abuse happens, those excuses for why abuse happens on the next slide or two. And finally, this last piece of the definition is sort of the foundation that holds the rest of it up. Sort of this belief system is one in which the abuser, the person who's controlling their partner, really does feel entitled, right, to limit both the human and civil rights of their victim. That could be free speech or free association, their pursuit of happiness, their access to healthcare, their decision, their right to choose whether or not they want to have a family or not. They really do make every effort to dehumanize their victim and not allow them to be treated with human dignity and respect. Equality or equity. So these sort of beliefs are we kind of catch-all phrase as entitlement beliefs. They feel entitled to do this. And so before I open it up for questions, I'm going to go to the next slide, but just know that this is the frame for this conversation. This is what we're talking about when we talk about domestic abuse and violence. And not everything that we're going to be talking about is necessarily criminal behavior. And we're going to talk about that as we continue. So I said we talk about some common justifications, and going back to that previous slide, that piece about sort of chosen purposeful behavior. I'd like to ask you all, what are explanations that you have heard or may have thought or think perhaps are the cause for why domestic violence happens? Feel free to pop that directly into the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself.
Here, I'll pop back in. One that I hear a lot is that they were abused themselves when they were younger, and yeah, that rubs me the wrong way. Just yeah.
Can you tell me why it rubs you the wrong way?
Just it feels very victim blamey in kind of a roundabout way, where it also kind of sets up the like this person was abused as a child and now they're abusing somebody else, and now that somebody else theoretically could become an abuser themselves, and that just kind of creates this really bad dynamic of like painting victims as potential abusers.
Sort of this fatalistic assumption or narrative that you're destined to become either a victim or somebody who uses abuse and violence if you yourself were exposed to abuse and violence as a child. I want you all to think for a second, if you don't, please don't answer because this is a personal question, but if you know anybody in your life who may have been exposed to violence as a child. And then I want you all to think about choices that that person, those people may have made as adults. And I would gather that many of them, maybe not all, but many of them went on to make very different choices as adults in terms of how they treat their own intimate partners and their own children. In fact, it is my experience that many people who work in the helping professions, whether that is law enforcement, whether that is healthcare providers or mental health care providers or advocacy services, may have had some experiences themselves of children and that made very different choices and conscious choices to make different, to approach their life and their relationships differently from what they were exposed to or experienced as children. And so it's important to note that, yes, there can be some, there are people who experienced abuse as children or were exposed to violence as children that then do go on to make choices as adults. And we need to, approach those individuals with compassion and also with accountability. You could have both of those things. And I think that that is something that people sometimes forget. It doesn't justify their choices as adults necessarily. And again, there are many people who go on to make very different choices who had very similar experiences. But you're correct, Matthew, that is a very common justification that is given for why people make these choices as young adults or adults. I'm seeing some stuff in the chat as well that's come up. Substances, alcohol makes somebody abusive. I'm seeing that come through a couple of times. So that's true. That's a common justification that people give for why somebody can't control themselves. They were drunk and they lost control. And it is also true that there are, people who use abuse and violence that do struggle with substance use disorder, but that is a separate issue that requires a distinct intervention. If you address substance use disorder, right, and we go back to that original definition that we were talking about, that pattern of coercive controlling behavior over time, that is not going to address that underlying belief system that that person has the right to control and harm their partner or their children or family members. It is also true that the presence of substances may increase risk in certain situations, or it may escalate certain situations. And somebody may feel like they, are uninhibited to use different types of violence they may not use when they are not using substances. And if you were to peel back the layers and look at sort of the totality of the circumstances and the rest of the relationship and the types of behaviors that were on display, you'll find that those patterns of control still exist. And so we have to hold both of those things true at the same time. Substances can increase risk, but they are not the cause of the violence or the behaviors to begin with. I'm seeing a few things come up too about temper and anger. I'd like to ask you all, who here has been angry? I'm raising my hand, I can't see everyone right now, but I'm seeing some thumbs up and some more hands raised. You can feel free to pop that in the chat. Yeah, anger is a really important and valid human emotion. It's not an excuse or is something to justify the belief that you have the right to control your partner and family. It's pretty simple. But it is important that we make that distinction because historically there has been an inappropriate, often people who have used abuse and violence have been inappropriately referred to anger management as an appropriate form of intervention for their behaviors. And we know now that that is not appropriate and that can make things more dangerous. The appropriate response is a certified batter intervention program, which we're not going to have a lot of time to talk about today, but just know that that is not an appropriate response or intervention option for somebody who's using abuse and violence. It's not an anger issue, it's a choice issue. I'm seeing a few other things that are coming through. They were pushed to it by the victim. If the victim had just left them alone, it wouldn't have happened, right? So blaming the victim for their choices, very common. I'm seeing Mary point out that sort of self-blame that victims put on themselves, that they've heard from the person in their life who's been using abuse against them. I shouldn't have said that, shouldn't have done that. It was my fault. I provoked them. Those are really common things that we hear from victims that in many ways are sort of the abusive person's voice ringing in their ears. And we're going to unpack that a little bit more when we do the skit. So you have a really good list started, and I'm going to pop this up here. This is a non-exhaustive list of common justifications, and you all really did identify many of them. So again, if you go back to the definition of domestic abuse and violence that we're using for this training, often you can find the answer to your question. We're talking about a pattern of coercive and controlling behavior over the course of time, right? Where one person is using their position of power to dominate, their victim and create fear. And this belief system that they are entitled to do so is what holds the rest of it up. That is what the choices of the abuser are, what cause domestic abuse and violence. Any questions about this? Okay.
Kelly, can you talk just for a second about mutual abuse? Because that was a piece that I didn't hear come out of the chat. I think that's super important for us to be clear about. What's that?
Thank you so much, Regina. So we're not going to talk in great detail about different types of abuse and violence that occur in relationships, but so I'm glad that you pointed that out. There's no such thing as mutual abuse when there's an imbalance of power. And so two other types of violence that may exist in a relationship where abuse is occurring are, the first is something that we call resistive reactive violence. And this is violence that is really produced and shaped by being a victim, being victimized. You can akin that to self-defense sometimes, or where somebody who has spent 10 years being, for all intents and purposes, beat down emotionally, physically, sexually for an extended period of time, finally says, nope, I've had enough, and they respond. But this violence is very different in terms of what it's intended to do. It lacks the power or the intention to control that human being throughout the course of that relationship. It may be to control a specific type of situation or try to gain back some form of agency, autonomy, and power that has been stripped by them. And we see this play out often within the criminal legal system. It is unfortunately the case that there are often victims who do end up getting arrested for using physical violence. But if you go back and look at sort of the totality of that relationship, it's very clear who the predominant aggressor really is. And there's a lot of work done with law enforcement to try and help them to assess who that actually is. But we do sometimes hear that sort of, it takes two to tango. They're both parties are using abuse and violence. But when you look back and see, okay, who has the power, right? The financial power, the access to resources, to friends, family, who's kind of controlling the narrative of that relationship and the lived experience of one of the people in that relationship, you'll see an imbalance. The other type of violence that we sometimes see is sort of like pathological violence. For example, a good example is maybe somebody who for their whole life never used physical violence, but maybe they have some form of dementia and they can't control their behavior now, and some of their sort of physical outbursts towards their caregiver or their partner, that without that dementia, that would not exist. There's sort of a mental illness or medical diagnosis that's sort of underlying that kind of physical violence. We have to be really careful though when we talk about that, because it is very are often the case that people who choose abuse and violence will try to weaponize a mental illness diagnosis as an excuse for why they are behaving the way that they are. So we want to talk briefly about who experiences domestic abuse and violence. We know that it's true that domestic abuse and violence occurs in all types of relationships, intimate partner and interfamilial, and across all socioeconomic and demographics. And we also do know that some people and groups of people are disproportionately impacted by this very, very prevalent public health issue. Who are some groups of people that might be disproportionately impacted? Feel free to unmute or pop it in the chat. People who identify as women. Yep, those who are in the LGBTQAI+ community. We've got two of those, so we're going to talk about that. People of color, thank you, Matthew. And so when we talk about disproportionate impact, on the one hand, we are talking about people's identities. And on the other hand, we're talking about sort of the world's, society's, systems responses to those people. The reality is that people do not experience IPV in a vacuum. They experience it within the context of their broader lived experience. And DV happens at the intersections. When we talk about intersections, we are talking about the various identities that people have. So for example, I will just share some of my identities right now. I am white, I am middle class, I am college educated, I am a woman, I identify as woman, I am cisgender, meaning that my gender identity matches my sex assigned at birth. So I hold a lot of what are center characteristics, right? My experience in the world has been shaped by many of these identities and by the system's responses to my identities. And so my experience, if I were to have any with domestic abuse and violence, may be very different from somebody who has different identities, where their intersecting identities are responded to differently by people in their lives and the systems that are responding to them. We're going to talk about that. Let's talk about gender for a minute. I'll come back to that slide in just a second. So the CDC uses a definition of IPV related impact, intimate partner violence related impact. And they define that as somebody being fearful, concerned for safety, injury, needing medical care or needing help from law enforcement, or they missed at least one day of work or missed at least one day of school. That's sort of an IPV related impact. And that's an additional sort of added definition to what we're talking about in terms of who has experienced either contact, sexual violence, physical violence, and or stalking by an intimate partner at least once in their lifetime. And so the data that comes from this survey, again, there are limitations to all sort of research and surveys at the population-based surveys, I should say. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 10 men have experienced what is known as an IPV related impact at least one time in their life. Yes, intimate partner violence. So a couple of things here. We see that both men and women are impacted by domestic abuse and violence, and that women are impacted at a disproportionate rate. And so when we're responding to the lived experiences of people who've experienced IPV, we have to understand that, and again, anyone can be a victim, and we also need to create interventions and responses that acknowledge the disproportionate impact on female identifying people. But let's talk for a second about the experience of trans people, because that's important, and we need to complicate our thinking when we're talking about domestic abuse and violence, which has historically been men's violence against women and other people. But looking at the huge rates of domestic abuse and violence or intimate partner violence that have been experienced by folks who identify as trans. So in 2015, there was a study done, the US Transgender Survey, and folks who responded to this survey, 54% of them had indicated that they had experienced some form of intimate partner violence at least one time in their lifetime. And so we want to be really clear, right, that again, when we're talking about domestic abuse and violence and who's disproportionately impacted, we want to understand sort of the gender dynamics. We also need to understand we don't want to be on a binary all the time. And that's really important because we don't want to create the continued unfortunate experience of invisibilizing people who identify as trans or who have different sexual orientations other than that of heterosexual. I want to briefly go back to this slide. We talk about prevalence and impact in the state of Maine. This is information from our annual report in 2020. And so despite the pandemic, advocates from MCEDV member programs around the state worked with just over 12,500 people. And you can also see of those, of the information we were able to gather, some of the different groups of people who may not be, who you think historically are impacted by this issue. This is some of the breakdown of those numbers. And so this wasn't a significant drop in number of people from 2019. And one thing that we did note, our advocates did note, is an increased length of time that helpline calls took, indicating an increase in complexity as a result of sort of the experience of the COVID-19 pandemic. Regina, I think it was like upwards of 20%. Is that correct? The length of calls, roughly about that?
Yeah, there was I think it was 22% increase in the length of calls. Yeah. And the other thing I would just throw in about these numbers, if I may, Kelly, is that because so much of our work is done over the phone and on the helpline, I have no doubt that we served more than, 246 people who identified as LGBTQ+ or as non-binary, right? But we don't necessarily always know that. So just another sort of caveat for putting these numbers in perspective. We really try to keep the services low barrier. And so when someone's calling us for a crisis helpline call, we're not sort of saying to them, and can we please get your demographics, right? Yes. So that's another way to sort of look at those numbers as well.
Thank you. And we also know that those numbers do not indicate the full experience of Mainers who are experiencing intimate partner violence, because we don't work with everyone. Not everyone calls our helplines, right? That is truly just a snapshot of sort of the scale of the public health issue in the state of Maine. I'm going to shift our attention just briefly to talk about another sort of statistic and also looking at sort of the gender dynamic of domestic abuse and violence. And we're talking about specifically intimate partner violence homicide. So you can see very clearly here in this graph, these two pie charts, that when we're looking specifically at intimate partner violence, so not interfamilial violence, a current or former intimate partner, we look at sort of the offenders. 88% of the offenders of intimate partner violence homicide in the state of Maine between 2000 and 2019 were male identified and 12% were female. And then when we look over at sort of the victims, we see a similar but not quite as skewed experience of who's being murdered. I will note that in the male identified pie slice on the victims by gender, that also does include new male partners of female victims who were murdered by that female victim's ex. And this, if you have any interest in looking at all of the bits from the homicide review panel, I really encourage you to look at the most recent report that was released, the 13th biannual report of the Maine Domestic Abuse Homicide Review Panel, which is where this data comes from. So that was our sort of very quick overview of the basics of domestic abuse and violence. But we're going to now do an activity and an exercise where we are going to learn a little bit more about what we mean when we talk about the dynamics of domestic abuse and violence. And so this activity Thank you for putting that in the chat, Regina. This activity, Regina has already given you all sort of your card or your number that you're going to read off. But each person who's been given a role to play or roles to play are going to read the slide that comes up, both who you are, so the name of the person that you are, for example, friend, minister, doctor, whatever, and the line written for you to say. Do not make up your own line. After that, Regina will respond as a woman experiencing abuse might be thinking or feeling in response to what you have just said. These are not things that she would necessarily or is saying out loud. This is really meant to reflect her inner process. After Regina speaks as the woman who's experiencing abuse and violence, I will provide the voice of the abuser, the voice that's in Regina's head. It's really important to remember that even if we are alone with a woman or a person experiencing abuse, the person abusing her is also in the room as well, because the victim carries that voice in her head, right? His threats, promises, opinions, his attitude. So we ask that you please stay quiet throughout the exercise unless it's your turn to read. And then we're going to discuss the responses afterwards. It's going to take about 15 minutes or so. And if you need to step away for any reason, please do so. But we're going to go ahead and get started. And just know there may be some choice language that is used throughout. I'd also ask, if possible, if you could pop up your video so that we could see. I myself am not going to have my video on because I want that to reflect sort of I am the voice of the abuser in the victim's head. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to stop my video, and then I'm going to move to the first slide. So who's ever number one, be prepared to unmute yourself and read the first line. Great.
Minister, I'm glad you came to see me about this. Do you have any idea why he hit you? Is he having a hard time at work?
I knew I shouldn't have come here. I feel so silly. I am making too much of this again. It's fine. He is having a lot of stress at work. He is. And I should just be more prayerful and patient. And I don't need to talk about this with people.
Please forgive me. I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have done that. God, but Rose, you know how hard I've been working, and I just really could use some support around here. And God, we made a promise to God. I mean, you're not going to throw that away. You're not going to just walk out on me, are you? I love you. I'm sorry.
Sleep troubles and anxiety often go hand in hand. We can try medications. I would also recommend you see a counselor. The good news is, I don't think there is anything medically wrong with you.
Yeah, that is so tempting. So tempting. I am exhausted all of the time. I can't sleep, and I just need to sleep, and he won't let me sleep. And even when he lets me sleep, I can't sleep.
Babe,
but I have been sober for 6 years, and I have to maintain that. I mean, a pill is not going to fix this, and I've got to be alert for the kids. I just don't know what to do, but I don't think I can take that pill.
Babe, I called the counselor today, and I was thinking, I made an appointment. Maybe we should go together. I know that I need help, and I mean, we both know that you do. Why don't you take those pills the doctor said would help you? Gosh, I think, I'm making some effort here to work on this, to work on our marriage. And I'd like you to kind of meet me halfway. I mean, it's the least you could do.
I just don't understand why you stay with him.
Sometimes I don't know why I stay with him. My God. Oh, it's so hard to explain it to people. I wish that my friends would just understand. He's not always like this. Like, it does get bad sometimes, but he's also the man that I love, and we have a family together, and he's such a good dad. And I know that man is still in there. I just want him to get some help, and I want us to get back to where we were. I know we can do that. I have faith that we can do that.
What have you been doing all day? Were you talking to that bitch, Mary? My God, if it's so hard to be with me, then get out. But you know what? You brought nothing to this marriage, and you're going to take nothing away. I mean, if you keep spreading lies about me to your friends, so-called friends, God, you better watch out. You see what's going to happen. God, you're such a bitch.
School social worker. Your son's teachers say his behavior is disruptive and he's not been passing in his assignments on time. I'd like to meet with you and his dad to talk about what we can do.
Oh, no. No. She has no idea how bad it's going to get. If Billy's dad finds out that he is behind again, I am just going to have to carve out the time to sit down and work on his homework with him. I've got to make that happen. I don't care about my work schedule, but his dad cannot find out about this. Absolutely not.
Why the hell did I help you go back to school those years ago? You know, we said that if you went back and got your degree, which I helped pay for, mind you, that you would still prioritize our children. I mean, you are so selfish. God, just thinking about yourself and your so-called career. I mean, you probably don't even do a good job. I mean, you literally, I don't know how you keep yourself together. You clearly aren't doing it for our kids. I mean, that is your priority, damn it. I mean, our son, not your stupid career as a CNA. Jesus.
Nurse, who did this to you?
God, I can't believe this has happened. I can't believe I'm here. Oh, what can I tell her? She's going to think I'm so stupid for staying with somebody who would do this to me. And she'd be totally right, but I can't have this conversation right now. I mean, the only reason I'm here is because I really think my arm might be broken this time, but the kids came downstairs and saw him hitting me, and that's the only reason he stopped, and I cannot have this conversation here right now. I've got to get home to my kids. I've got to get home to my kids right now.
Rose, you know you're my wife, right? And what happens in our house stays in our house. I mean, if you start spreading rumors about me, about us, I might lose my job. I mean, what would happen then? Do you want that to happen? Do you want us to lose our house, everything? God, you got to keep your trap shut.
Coworker, did you hear about that domestic violence homicide? The newspaper said there had been a lot of police calls to that house. I would never let someone treat me that way. Would you?
I am so scared right now. Because I did find out about that poor woman, because when I was having breakfast this morning, he brought in the paper and then he folded it so that that headline was right on top, and he just set it down in front of me when I was having breakfast and put his hands right framing around the words. And then he kissed me on my forehead and he walked out the door. I am so scared right now. So scared.
Go ahead, Rose. Leave. I'll find you wherever you go.
Her dad. I told you he was no good. If he ever lays a hand on you again, I'll kill him.
Dad, you're only going to make it worse. With my luck, now you're going to be the one to go and do something stupid and end up in jail, and it's going to be on me. I wish you'd never even found out. Just stop. It's not helping.
I mean, running to your dad again? When are you ever gonna handle your own shit? I mean, aren't you embarrassed by yourself? I mean, I am. I mean, aren't you a grown-ass woman with kids and a husband? I mean, running to daddy? It's honestly incredibly embarrassing.
Police officer, when your neighbor called, she was really concerned about you. We are too. What happened tonight?
Oh my God, the police, what is he gonna do to me now? What is he gonna do to me now? He always said that I could never call the police, and I didn't call the police, but what is he gonna do to me now?
You didn't call the police, did you? You hit me first, remember? I mean, didn't I tell you what would happen to you if you ever called the police? You're in for it now. Therapist, thank you for telling me about your husband's arrest last week. That couldn't have been easy to talk about. Have you thought about staying in a shelter for a while?
Yeah, staying in a shelter. How is this my life? How is this my life? I did everything right. I went to school, I got married, I had my kids, I've worked my whole life. I have a home. It's a beautiful home. I love it. How is it possibly my life that I am now packing up my kids and taking a duffel bag each and going into a shelter somewhere? This cannot be happening to me right now.
Babe, honey, God, where are you? I'm so sorry. The house is so empty, and you know that I can't live without you. You and the kids are everything to me. Please come home. You know, I mean, if you don't, I mean, I called your therapist, and she sounds pretty hot. Maybe she'll just move in with me.
His mom. How can you drag this through the courts? He'll lose his job. You know he loves you. He needs your support.
His mother. His mother. You know what? I know who's getting dragged through the courts right now, and it does not feel like him, because I know what is going to happen on that court date. He's going to show up, and his mom's going to be there, and his dad's going to be there, and his boss is going to be there, and the minister's going to be there, and he's going to have a good attorney, and I can't even afford one, and they're all going to line up and talk about how great he is and how upstanding he is, and I am going to be by myself. I'm going to be by myself. And I'm going to have to try to convince them all to believe me. It's my word against his. The idea that he is getting dragged through the courts right now is laughable to me.
No one's going to believe you, Rose. And I mean, no one's ever going to love you. I'm the only one that is ever going to love you. If you testify against me in this case, you are going to regret it.
Kids, Mom, I want to go home. I miss my kitten and my bedroom. I don't want to go to a new school.
I know, sweetheart. I know. I'm so sorry. I am so sorry. I feel so terrible about what this is doing to the kids. I mean, they don't understand. Their whole world is turned upside down. They're in this weird place, this shelter. Honestly, he was so mad when we left. I have no idea if that kitten is even still alive. I don't know what to tell them about the kitten. Oh God.
If you leave me, I'm going to report you for being an unfit mom. You know you're going to lose the kids. I mean, I'll tell them that you're using. I know what you've been doing with your prescription. Have you had a drink lately, Rose? I'm going to bury you in more ways than one.
child protective worker. Have you called the Domestic Violence Resource Center about getting a protective order? We need to be sure you can keep your children safe.
Who called child protective? Why are they talking to me? They're gonna take my kids. I would never hurt my kids. I keep my kids safe. That's what I do. Who called child protective?
Are you trying to get me fired? I'm at work and a sheriff's deputy shows up and serves me with a protection order? God, I mean, you're incredible. Don't you know? I'll make sure the state knows all about your list of psychiatric meds. You're gonna lose those fucking kids.
Judge, the children will visit their father every other weekend.
This is a nightmare. This is an absolute nightmare. How can I send them to him? He didn't change a single diaper for any of them. He has never made a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. How can I send them to him? I've always been there to protect them. And now I'm supposed to let them go and just be there the whole weekend without me? Oh my God.
Well, 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 it is about time somebody saw my side of things. And you heard what the judge said. And you know what? Every other weekend is not enough. You're going to be hearing from my attorney.
Kids, Dad said you're bipolar and off your meds. That's why he can't come home.
This is so hard. I mean, he's always loved to diagnose me and give me all sorts of reasons why everything's wrong with me. But now he's passing it on to them. I guess that I should just be glad. I mean, if they've forgotten everything that's gone down, it's better for them. I just hope they'll forgive me someday. I'll sort it out someday. I have to live with it for now.
Rose, I really miss you, honey. I'm so sorry. You know, I can tell that you're working so hard. I want to be a better man. I want to be a better husband. And I just want to move forward with you. And I want to have our home together and our kids together. And I want to provide. And I want you to go back to work. I want to support you in this. I'm so sorry. I got all messed up, and I know you're real serious this time, and so am I. And I miss my family. I miss you, Rose. I love you.
Sister, he called me crying and real upset. He said he couldn't live without you.
Maybe I should talk to him. I mean, he's got to know I'm serious by now. I've never stayed away this long, and he's struggled with depression his whole life. I couldn't deal with it if he killed himself. I could not deal with it if he killed himself. I don't know how I would say that to our children. Maybe I should just call him, and maybe we could just meet and have a conversation. I don't know how I would tell the kids if their dad killed himself and it was my fault.
Go ahead and try and run. I will find you wherever you go.
Isn't it, defense attorney, isn't it true that you invited him in that night?
You know what? It is true. It is true that I invited him in that night because it was Jimmy's birthday and we were just about to light the candles on the cake. We'd just gotten out of shelter. We have our own little apartment now. We are celebrating. He's not even supposed to know where I am, to say nothing of coming near us, but we were just about to light the candles and there was a knock at the door. And before I could get there, the kids had it open and they were saying, Daddy, Daddy's here. It's my birthday. Daddy's here. And he said, I've just come for the cake. I've just come to have some cake with my son. So what was I supposed to do? He was calm. He didn't look like he would hurt me. And so I said, sure, you can come in for 5 minutes while we have a piece of cake. And the next thing I know, his hands were around my neck. So yes, I did invite him in that night, I guess.
You just have to push my buttons. I just wanted to see my kids, but you had to get in my face, didn't you? God, I mean, you're such a bitch. You deserve all of this. You know that? This is all your fault. It's always your fault. Look what you've done to our family. You've ripped us apart. You've ruined my life. God, why don't you just go kill yourself?
Judge, guilty of domestic violence assault, 30 days, all suspended, and 1 year's probation, including completion of a certified batterer intervention program.
All right, folks. That is the end of the exercise of the skit. I always like to take a breath or two after we do that. Thank you all so very much for participating. It is really hard to listen to and to be an active participant in. We really recognize that. And so before we sort of go into sort of picking apart and analyzing that activity as we learn about sort of the dynamics, what we're talking about when we're talking about domestic abuse and violence, I'd just like for you all to sort of share your initial reactions. How are you feeling right now? If you want to share, you can unmute. I'm seeing some stuff come in the chat.
First up, Regina, you are a very good actress. And I'm just, I don't know. I'm really frustrated. Like I expected it to go this way. I'm so frustrated with how much the system is pitted against survivors and against people who are trying to get out of these situations.
Mm-hmm. We hear that a lot, sort of frustration. And we're going to talk about that. And when we think about, I'm going to ask you all in response to that, you know, the various systems in the life of Rose, the survivor, many of them didn't say or do anything wrong. They just have one little perspective, one vantage point, one purpose in the wider lived experience of Rose and her life and her family. And yet, we are all part of one piece of a system, right? And when we think about the messages that one individual is going to receive throughout the course of their life from the criminal legal system, from child welfare, from the person who's harming them, from friends, family, people within their faith community, their employer, advocacy services, mental health providers, healthcare providers, right? It's a lot. It is a lot for one person to carry. And it's a lot for somebody to carry even if they aren't experiencing abuse and violence. All of us in this Zoom room right now engage with many, many systems on a daily basis or weekly basis. Add this layer of experiencing domestic abuse and violence, right? And being victimized by the person that is supposed to love you and care for you and support you. And it adds a different kind of weight. This is just a tip of the iceberg in terms of what somebody may experience.
Hey, Kelly, a few more things that have been shared in the chat around people's reactions are that they feel exhausted, frustrated, discouraged, and also an acknowledgement of the power of that reflection of survivors' experience. So just wanted to bring those to the group as well, because it's hard to sit through. And then it's also, I think, it's a hard thing to listen to, but it's also hard to then sit through what I think I'm hearing come out of this group, which is like, I'm discouraged with my own work. I'm discouraged with my own role here. I'm discouraged with how we get traction in these systems to create change. So just wanted to bring that into the room.
Thank you, Regina. I appreciate that. And I echo that. I certainly get frustrated too and can get discouraged. And I have to remind myself that the only person who's responsible for what's happened to that victim, right, is the abusive party, right? The abusive person. They are responsible for their choices and what they've done to that victim. And as service providers or as people who are concerned others, friends, family, we have the opportunity, at least on the individual level, in the work that we do every day, to respond to victims with compassion and understanding, and even in very imperfect systems. And so this session is not meant to do a deep dissection of the ways in which our many systems have failed victim survivors regularly, although that's a part of the conversation. But there is opportunity for us as service providers to have these voices in our head too, and think about these voices and the little changes that we can do on the micro level in the day-to-day lives of victims, survivors that we're working with. And we're going to talk a little bit about, as we move forward, ideas and opportunities for how we can be better and ways that we can take a trauma-informed approach or use a trauma-informed lens in our day-to-day work. And we're going to continue that conversation. I also want to point out, we're going to actually pull up before we move forward, and we're going to use something called the power and control wheel to talk about some of the tactics that we heard. But a lot of this conversation is about barriers, right? Child welfare needs to make sure that Rose can keep her kids safe. And, shelter services have to do an intake, and that might be difficult for somebody. The criminal legal system has a case that it's trying to prosecute, and they may want Rose's testimony to make it a solid case, and that may be hard for Rose. And that's something that we will talk about with victim witness advocates in particular, and your role in that process. The healthcare provider, let's say that Rose was trans and misgenders Rose, right? There's lots of ways in which many systems miss the mark. And so we're talking about barriers and how can we create ways to make access to services and support and safety as low barrier as possible. Some of it is outside of our individual controls, but there is more power than I think we realize, particularly if we're already working within those systems. What are ways that we can sort of move the needle? So I'd like to ask you, how do you think Rose's experience might have been different if she were just developmentally challenged, or if she was a woman of color, or if she was facing deportation? What if we changed some of the circumstances and Rose was a teenager, right? What about if Rose was an elderly person? What if she was 90 years old? What if she was a Native American or a tribal citizen living on tribal land, or questioning, her gender identity, right? We have to think about making sure in all of our work that we're sort of centering the most marginalized people, most marginalized identities in all that we do, because our systems are not designed to support those people. They're just not. And so anytime we're doing an activity or we're talking about the experience of domestic abuse and violence, please don't forget that it looks very different depending on many, many factors. And also, frankly, it looks very much the same as well. We're going to talk about some of those tactics. I'm going to share my screen again. And I would just like to brainstorm briefly for those of us on this call who are victim witness advocates as well. What are some lines that we could sort of add to the skit that a victim witness advocate might say, while well-intended, may create fear or anxiety or frustration for a survivor of domestic abuse and violence? And this is not to pick on victim witness advocates, because we just saw all of the systems that in many ways miss the mark, albeit unintentionally. Or what's something that you've had to say, right, in your practice as a victim witness advocate through a DA's office, that when you look at the whole experience of a victim survivor may have ended up being frustrating to them, that you may not have control over?
Maybe just telling them that they're going to need to come to court. I mean, that can cause extreme anxiety with everything else that's already going on, and just fitting in the time and the fear of how that's going to upset the abuser. And so the requirement of them coming to court, I think, is something that's, overwhelming.
Such a good point. And again, that is not something, you're not intending to cause distress or anxiety for that victim. You're just stating a fact. Rose, you're going to need to come to court on June 16th to be questioned by the prosecutor. That's a fact-based statement, right?
Right.
Another one is that the conversation isn't entirely confidential, and there might be things shared with a victim witness advocate that need to be shared with the prosecutor and then also the defense attorney.
So well said, Kara. Thank you. Who here has seen, oh, please go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to throw one in that I've thought of for my role as an advocate, which was sometimes survivors didn't understand the difference between you all's role, who have the title. I know some people are trial assistants or victim witness coordinators, but for those who are victim witness advocates, I've had survivors be very confused by the difference between what you all do and what we all do in the domestic violence advocacy programs. And there are important differences in our roles, right? Like, as Kara was saying, some things aren't going to be confidential and have to be shared. And like, has that come up for you all ever? Because I've heard that as people are like, wait, but I thought they were working with you because they're an advocate. And so then we have to sort of describe the roles and stuff. Maybe that's such a great example. It's resonating that it's all gray screens. We don't know.
It's certainly something that, I've heard as well, and something we're going to be chatting about when we sort of look at the specific roles of community-based advocates, domestic abuse and violence advocates at some of the member programs, and sort of how we can create sort of a trauma-informed coordinated community response and opportunities for collaboration between the unique roles of both. This graphic right here is something called the power and control wheel. Who has not heard of this or seen this before? Feel free to just say me in the chat. Yeah, so it sounds like, and it looks like most of you, all of you have, which is wonderful. Great. So I'm not going to give a whole lot of detail about what this is, but just because it is being recorded and we want folks to be able to access this information later, this is a tool that was developed by a group of female identifying survivors in Duluth, Minnesota in the late 70s, early 80s. And they basically got together and realized, they started sharing their lived experience of victimization and realized, wow, they were experiencing so many of the same controlling tactics. And they created this graphic, this tool that sort of divvies up the various tactics that abusive people use to exert and obtain and maintain power and control over victims into various categories. And so on this, you can see coercion and threats, intimidation, male privilege, using children, minimizing, denying, and blaming, economic abuse, isolation, and emotional abuse. On the outer band, you'll see physical violence and sexual violence, and sort of this is the band that holds it all together. There are certainly situations where physical violence and sexual violence is never used or is only used sparingly or one time, but the threat that it may happen is often enough to elicit some form of compliance. And so thinking back to the skit that we just heard, I'd just like to ask briefly, of these various tactics that you see on this wheel here, you heard me describe, what examples did you hear in the skit? Feel free to unmute or pop in the chat.
I definitely saw an example of using the children, specifically in Regina's portion of the skit, when she was asked by the defense attorney why she allowed the abuser to enter the home. And she said it because the abuser came on the child's birthday and really used the child's connection to them as their dad to kind of twist the bail conditions and the protection order conditions, where she felt she was cornered because he arrived unexpectedly. The children, it was their birthday. They said, please, daddy, stay. And I think that was definitely using the children against her.
Absolutely. Lots of points where the kids were weaponized, for lack of a better word, or very accurately described.
I definitely saw a combination of the using coercion and threats and using intimidation kind of used in conjunction with the like mess with me and see what'll happen. Also, I don't know where this would fall on the wheel, but the like putting the newspaper, just kind of leaving that on the table, like if that wasn't intimidation, I don't know what was.
And that's such a great, I'm so sorry, Kelly, you
Oh,
can't
please.
I was just gonna say, and that's such an important example, right? Because it is not in any way illegal to put a newspaper down on the table in front of one's spouse, right? And for many of us, like, I could put a newspaper down in front of Kelly. I've probably done that, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. So that's a great example of a clear instance of intimidation and in fact threat to me, to my character, that is not necessarily going to be easily recognized by other people. Like what that means might not be clear to just somebody who comes into the house and sees that paper on the table, right? And that's a really frequent tactic that abusive people use, like those sort of, this means something within the context of what's going on in my relationship, but without that context, it's probably not going to mean much to you.
Yeah, like without the nuance, it kind of gets lost. Because if somebody just says like, oh, like my husband put a newspaper down in front of me, it's like, well, like what does that mean?
Exactly. Or if law enforcement is responding and Rose, the character, is trying to respond, say, he put this newspaper in front of me, and you know, again, that means something very different depending on the context in which that occurred. I see a couple things popping up too in the chat. Mary, you mentioned emotional abuse, and as you mentioned, minimizing, denying, and blaming. I don't know if either one of you want to share any specific examples of either one of those that you observed.
As far as the emotional abuse, a lot of the undertones of the conversation were really blaming her for what was going on, that she was crazy, that she needs to take her meds, she's bipolar, and just putting her down in general.
In our experience working with victim survivors, so many of them talk about the impact of constant verbal and emotional abuse and violence that is used against them, and sort of the wearing down and the impact that has. And many of them say that constant experience is far more damaging than any physical violence that they experience. Not true for everyone, but that often does has been our experience hearing that. I mean, how many times he called her a bitch, or he called her other horrible things. I mean, hearing that regularly it has an impact on somebody's emotional health and well-being. Okay, well, this tool is something that DV advocates use regularly, and I think it is also a really powerful thing to, for all victim services professionals to be familiar with and to refer back to when you're working with victim survivors, and to think about the various ways in which these tactics are employed to control and elicit compliance from a victim. And just know that many of these tactics can continue after an abuser has been arrested and a criminal case has been adjudicated. We have to remember that. It's not just something that happens while somebody is in a relationship. We saw that throughout the life of the skit that we participated in. You know, Rose had left, right? And so we're going to talk about that now when we talk about centering victim survivor safety, and have a question about fears that we have as professionals and as private citizens. So I have a question. What do we, or what do you fear will happen to someone who stays in a relationship with someone who is abusive towards them? And so I'd like for you to unmute or share those fears or those concerns in the chat. Physical harm. We have a fear that they will be physically harmed. Yep. We have a fear that they will be a victim of homicide. Terrified that they would be killed or die. Yep. Seeing that still, that is a fear. What are some other fears that we have? What we fear will happen to someone who stays in a relationship with someone who's abusive towards them? I see Christina saying if they stay, there is a risk they could end up, quote, stuck because the abuser has all of the economic control. Yeah, so we fear the economic impact. Megan Duvall is providing a specific technical criminal behavior that they could be criminally restrained. Sarah's sharing that they could die by suicide, the victim. Also the fear, Matt's sharing, being afraid that being separated from that person, that could also cause fear because of social isolation. So the fear that that victim may have, that they may be mentally, that they may struggle with mental illness or other types of mental illnesses or diagnoses, like perhaps depression or low self-esteem, things like that, the impact on somebody's emotional health and well-being. We've got a good list going. Megan's adding to sort of the control of money, so they can't support themselves. Kara, thank you. We're fearful for what could happen and the harm that could happen both physically and emotionally to a victim's children. So you all have shared a lot of very accurate fears that many people share. And here is just an inexhaustive list of some of the things that might happen, that we fear might happen, that do happen to people who, quote, choose to stay in a relationship where abuse is occurring. Now I'd like to ask you all, do we have any fears about what might happen to them if they leave? I mean, we're so concerned, right? Like, you need to leave, right? Rose needs to get out of there. She needs to be safe. I'm seeing in the chat that we have very similar fears, that the victim could be killed, that they could be retaliated against, up to and including homicide again. Matt, you've shared that leaving is the most dangerous time for survivors, and you are correct, not incorrect. That is accurate. You're also adding, Jamie, that it's the same list as if they had stayed. Yeah. Fear of escalation, fear of stalking, losing of friends, support and family because of being manipulated by the abuser. Absolutely. So you all are spot on. All of these things are still a risk. So why do we ask the question, right? If it's coming from a place of concern and fear for safety, why do we ask the question, why do you stay? Why don't you just leave? When in fact, we know now, and probably you knew before, that the risks remain the same often. And yet as a society, as various systems, we get into this mindset that leaving is the answer and leaving is going to stop the abuse, when in fact, that's a myth. This framework puts the victim of abuse who stays in the position of responsibility for all future abuse, as if the problem was the victim staying rather than the abuser's behavior. Collectively, we need to shift this stay-leave paradigm, right? It's really critical. And instead, we need to reframe our fear and our concern to this idea of safety planning. Exactly. We want the victims to be safe. And so if we want them to be safe, right, we need to use that framework. So what are some things that could help a victim be safe? What are some things that could be part of someone's safety plan? Feel free to unmute or pop it in the chat. So I'm seeing changing locks. So some very like tangible, like in the moment safety, providing 911 only phones, again, a tangible sort of resource that a victim could use. Yep. What are some other things? Address confidentiality. So there is an address confidentiality program in the state of Maine. So trying to remain confidential. A protection order, certainly. Having access to economic resources. It's one of the most critical, I mean, we all need access to economic resources to live a life of freedom and, you know, do the things we want to do. We need to have some money. We need to have access to money, not just, you know, to survive, but also to thrive often in some capacities. Making sure that a person has a safe, protected place to stay should they leave. Yeah, looking at some planning there, Matthew. Support broadly, encouraging the victim that you will help them with whatever they need and not waver on that, right? So making sure that, Megan, you're making promises that you can keep and being really clear about that. Yeah. So you all have shared a lot of things that could be part of someone's safety plan. Some of these things you shared are sort of in the acute emergent space. Some of them are long-term. And we know that safety planning is something that is nonlinear. It's different for everyone and unique, and it changes often because of circumstances that are regularly beyond the control of the victim. So these are some things that could be part of somebody's safety plan. We've talked about many of them. Support systems, friends, family, clergy or coworkers, access to a domestic violence helpline, perhaps a support group, access to money, just a safe place to go and to be, as Matthew said. A protection order was mentioned. Sometimes law enforcement response or police response is part of somebody's safety plan. Sometimes it's not, right? In the video with Rose, in the skit with Rose, Rose was really terrified that her neighbor had called police, you know, and she was worried about what might happen to her because of the threats that, you know, the abusive person, her husband had made against her. This next one, accurate information, we're going to circle back to because this is something that victim services providers can play such a critical role and making sure we're providing accurate information about processes, but that are often very complicated. Some more tangible things: access to transportation, childcare, various documentation, any health specific needs that somebody has, medication. Child welfare could be part of somebody's safety plan or not, right? And so if there's one takeaway, one, stop asking the question, why does she stay or why do they stay? And two, start reframing, right, that question through a lens of safety. How can I support you to be as safe as possible today and in the future? What do you need from me? And being honest about the limitations of what you can provide is also very important. And so knowing this piece, and as we frame safety, we certainly do have enough time to watch this video. And we're going to shift into this idea of a coordinated community response and using a trauma-informed approach to the work that we do as victim service providers every day with victims of abuse. The video is about 8.5 minutes long, and there's a Scottish accent, so sometimes it's a little bit hard to hear, so just bear with me. If it is difficult, just let me know. We can try to translate later, sort of like this, the generalities of sort of what the video is talking about. So I'm going to pop this up and play. Hopefully that it works right away, and then we will discuss after.
We need to take a statement so we can establish what happened on Saturday night.
What time did you get back to David's flat? What time? I don't know.
Can you give us an estimate?
I don't remember.
Would your pals remember what time you left the club?
He seemed nice.
She didn't remember much, did she?
I know. And now we've got to waste more time on a daft lecture. We know how to deal with victims. We've had years of experience.
Well, some of us have had more years than others.
I'm in my prime, I'll have you know.
That'll be right. Today's session is about trauma. The latest in brain science will help you in your work. I'll start with a tour of the parts of the human brain. The reptilian brain maintains basic bodily functions. The limbic system is also instinctive. It deals with fear and pleasure. For example, you pat a dog, it senses pleasure, and without thinking, wags its tail. The neocortex is the site of logic, imagination, planning, and control. It's more sophisticated, but because it's conscious, it's slower than the older parts of the brain. The amygdala is a key part of the limbic system. It has one job: to sense danger and set off the alarm. When it's a matter of survival, the primitive parts of the brain override the conscious part. There are 3 possible survival responses: fight, flight, or the one that people don't think of, freeze. When the alarm goes off, blood and oxygen are diverted to muscles, adrenaline floods the body, and all systems that are not crucial to survival are switched off. Normally, the job of the hippocampus is to file memories so you can retrieve them later. But in times of danger, it stops filing memories, which makes it harder to gather evidence later on. Instead, the hippocampus switches to pumping cortisol. What's useful about cortisol is it stops us feeling pain, so we can focus on survival. Can anyone give me an example?
A farming accident where a man carried his own arm for a mile without feeling any pain?
Yes, excellent example. It is an evolutionary safety mechanism, which is fast and instinctive. In essence, it's our body's very clever way of protecting us. To recap, an example of the 3 parts of the brain working together. You're standing at a bar. Your reptilian brain is keeping your heart beating. You're enjoying the pleasure of a nice pint with your limbic system. You're using your neocortex to work out if there's time for another before the last train. What could happen to make the amygdala kick in? What if this happened? The way you'd respond would depend not on your logical brain, but on your instinctive brain. Being glassed in a bar would be a traumatic experience. Who can give me another example of an event that can cause trauma? War?
Rape?
A car crash? Good, yes. Trauma occurs when a person is overwhelmed by something beyond their control. The survival brain takes over the rational brain. It can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, with symptoms that last at least a month. Vicarious or secondary trauma is something you may experience if you deal with incidents such as rape or sudden death, or think of Lockerbie, Dunblane. You're not superheroes. Having a brain makes you all vulnerable to secondary trauma. It's important to understand that when trauma occurs again and again, it can become complex PTSD, such as in domestic abuse or child sexual abuse. The alarm system in the brain becomes jammed. Memories are stuck in the limbic system, so a trigger can set off the alarm. The trigger could be anything: a colour, a smell, a sound, a sensation. Now, the indicators of trauma. What should you be looking out for? Depression. Crying a lot? Yes, that's one response. And at the other end of the spectrum, total numbness.
Nightmares? Flashbacks?
Stress. Good, yes. And they may feel sick. Also, shame, feelings of guilt, inability to enjoy sex, social isolation, triggers. People often feel overwhelmed by the symptoms of trauma. This can lead to using alcohol or other drugs to block out memories, or self-harm, or dissociation when a person's mind detaches from reality. Indicators can be specific to the type of trauma. Say, dental problems, when someone who was orally abused avoids going to the dentist. A victim of abuse might bond strongly to her abuser. This is known as traumatic bonding, or Stockholm syndrome. And jumbled up memory, when a person's normal recording of memories doesn't work. Can you recall any times you've seen that symptom?
What time? I don't know.
A traumatized person may not seem like her usual self, or may be hypervigilant, on edge, or being startled by everyday things. Everyone is different. You never know what impact trauma will have. Symptoms can change from day to day. So what does all this mean in practice, in your job? A traumatized person's brain is protecting them, but that normal human response of self-protection can get in the way of evidence gathering. The US military has developed new trauma-informed interviewing techniques that you can use to work around this. Research shows that if someone seems vacant, they could be distracted by their traumatic memories. Try to ground them by asking a simple, non-patronizing question such as, "Are you thirsty? Do you want a glass of water?" This can help bring them back to the here and now. Don't expect a logical, linear story. Ask, "What can you recall just now?" Find out what the victim physically felt or saw. Working this way, from the instinctive sensory parts towards the logical parts of the brain, you'll get more results. In conclusion, 4 things for you to take away. Trauma response is the brain in survival mode. Repeated abuse can make trauma symptoms worse. In response to trauma, people will behave in unexpected ways. Remember, trauma is a normal human response to abnormal events.
We know that you've gone through a really painful experience, but we need to take a statement to understand what happened on Saturday night.
Are you able to tell us anything that you remember about his flat? Anything at all?
A dog. Barking.
Are you able to remember any physical sensations or feelings that you had?
Cigarette smoke. can smell it now.
What was going through your mind?
I couldn't understand it. I just couldn't move or even scream.
To freeze is a perfectly normal response. So you start with the memories, you don't start at the beginning. You have to engage with feelings to get to the facts.
Makes sense. Check you, Professor, getting all sciencey on us.
Well, if it gets us usable evidence.
There's life in the old dog yet.
Aye.
All right. So that's a video that I've seen many, many times and still find it, I find little bits more that I take away with me, little gems. Obviously that video is geared primarily towards law enforcement and evidence collection and interviewing techniques. And yet much of what they were talking about applies to direct services in an advocacy capacity regularly. And so I'd like to open it up to you all to ask, were there things in that video that you hadn't thought of before, or things that resonated with you, or things that they suggested doing that you yourself have employed in your work that you have seen yield successful results? Feel free to unmute or put it in the chat.
So I thought it was really helpful to kind of focus on like what the survivor can remember versus like the 10,000 question approach of like what was happening at this time? When did you leave? What is this? Like how did you get there? When did you leave? Like instead of just kind of working with, oh, hello Archer, my cat's here. Instead of that, just working with like, what did you feel? Like, what can you remember? And even like little things can be helpful.
Yeah, so sort of taking that open-ended question approach. Matthew, what do you have a vehicle?
Me personally?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
What color is your vehicle?
It is black.
Matthew, can you tell me about your vehicle?
It's a 2010 Subaru Outback. Super needs to be cleaned.
So when you're thinking about two different approaches to asking questions, the first two questions I asked were closed-ended and yielded one-word answers. In fact, yes and black. When I asked you open-ended, can you tell me about your vehicle? I learned the year, the make, the model, that it's a little bit dirty perhaps. And so that is one approach you can take when working with victims, is to ask general open-ended questions. Can you tell me a little bit about what happened? Anything that you can remember? And so that is one thing that we do, when working with victim survivors, is to ask those open-ended questions and to reflect back to victims what we're hearing in these sort of tools of active listening. I know that Mikasa is going to do a much more a deeper dive into sort of trauma-informed advocacy work later on this month, but just wanted to lay this bit out there right now in preparation for that session. Were there other things that people heard that they found particularly helpful, or things that they do already, or an example of working with somebody in a de-identified way that they've found any of those tools or other tools helpful?
I thought it was really helpful when they described with the trauma brain, that when you experience multiple instances of trauma, which a lot of our clients do because of domestic violence, they're living with their abuser. It's not like one incident of sexual assault or rape. It's like a consistent thing, that their memories are then combined, and their brain can be triggered by anything. I really like that visual depiction of that, because it definitely is helping me kind of conceptualize what it's like for my clients, because when I'm asking them questions to, I'm an attorney. So when I'm asking them questions to prepare for their case, I need to know the facts. And I think understanding this more, how trauma affects their brain, I think is definitely going to help me with my patients if they're telling me inaccurate information with different sessions. I need, like, it's a helpful reminder to myself that they're probably not doing it intentionally, and that their brain truly is impacted by trauma.
Thank you for sharing that, Christina. I so appreciate that perspective and the specific role that you have, and many of you have if you work in the criminal legal system on criminal cases in particular, or civil legal cases. The facts matter. They're very important. And yet, I think we have shown throughout the skit in particular, right, that we do live in a world that judges victim survivors for their choices and reinforces messages that abusers give them. And we can sometimes be impatient or not very compassionate for victims when, God, they can't remember anything. We think that they might be lying, right? Or being obstinate on purpose. Kara, you've mentioned that this video sort of helped normalize the survivor's response. And that's what a trauma-informed approach does. We start viewing, symptoms, quote, symptoms as survival strategies. We shift the focus from, or the idea that certain symptoms are what's wrong with somebody. So we stop saying, thinking that the idea, what's wrong with you, and we shift to this framework of what happened to you. And we're talking about domestic abuse and violence in particular, so that survival, these symptoms that people are exhibiting, is often taking place within the context of an ongoing threat. We're not talking necessarily about a singular acute incident of trauma that somebody may have experienced, for example, like a car accident. But we're talking about continually experiencing a pattern of coercive controlling behavior where that victim is being dominated by their abusive partner. And so this really helps. I think this can help us be more compassionate, more understanding, more patient with victims that we're working with. And while I'm certainly not a neuroscientist and an expert in brain chemistry, this makes sense at a very basic level. And so I think that may help us in sort of our approach with victims. I know how busy you all are in whatever capacities that you're working. There's always too much to do and never enough time or human resource to do it. And sometimes we can feel rushed when working with victim survivors. We can feel irritated that, they can't get there on time, X, Y, Z, all the things. And yet it's not because they don't want to often. It's often because they're having trauma responses. Not always, but often. So I'm gonna share my screen again for the last 15 minutes or so. And we're just gonna share a few. These are a few things that might be helpful for you to think about saying when you're working with a victim survivor. I'm concerned for your safety and the safety of your children. It's okay to express concern. It's okay to share, you don't deserve to be treated this way and you haven't done anything wrong. I'm sorry that this happened to you. How can I help? Many people experience this and you're not alone, and this is not your fault. And you can say that in a way that doesn't minimize what they're experiencing currently, saying, oh yeah, a lot of people experience this, no big deal. That's not the purpose of saying something like that, but it's also to make somebody feel less alone and less isolated, that they're the only one. They aren't. These statements can be really empowering and are often very supportive, and can often be an antidote to what they're hearing on a regular basis from the abusive person. Everything is the victim's fault in the abuser's eyes. And that threat has run true throughout the session, some of the responses you've all provided. So I want to shift gears for a second and talk a little bit about some of the work that the Maine's Domestic Violence Resource Centers provides and does around the state. So for those of you who aren't familiar, there are 9 agencies statewide. 8 are specific domestic violence resource centers, and then the Immigrant Resource Center of Maine is a culturally specific organization that provides specific services for new Mainers in Maine, and they are a member of MCEDV as well. So these are some of the broad services that our member programs provide, pretty much similar across the board. You know, maybe a little different in different places in terms of who's the person to contact or how things are situated, but these are the basic services that all of the member programs provide in some capacity. Really, the point of entry to a DVRC, a Domestic Violence Resource Center, is the helpline. Every resource center has a 24-hour toll-free helpline, and if you're not really sure what your point of entry is to get connected with them, that's what you do. You call the helpline. We've talked a lot about safety planning and what that looks like, or what that could be. This is what DVRCs are experts in. There's a lot of flexibility that DVRCs have in the work that we do and the mandates that we have or they have. And this again looks different for everyone, but it could be helping a victim apply for Section 8 housing. It could be helping somebody register for an online course, but they're having difficulty getting their email set up. It could be helping that person into shelter or into emergency shelter services. Not all programs have a physical shelter building, but all resource centers provide shelter services. Emergency sheltering is only a very small piece of what domestic violence resource centers actually do. And even though that's a myth we're trying to counter, it's a very small piece of the work that folks do. Support groups. Many of the programs have ongoing or specific time-framed support groups for victim survivors, sort of to help combat that isolation. As we talked about, it can be really powerful and helpful to understand that you're not the only one experiencing this horrible thing. And there's a lot of comfort in being able to get some peer support through the expert sort of guidance and facilitation of a trained advocate. Some other pieces too, transitional housing is a part of all of the programs, and some case management services as a result. Some housing case management, housing navigation is something that many of the programs provide. And then legal advocacy and representation. So I know that Christina is on the call here, and Christina is a staff attorney at Caring Unlimited down in York County. Not all of the programs have an on-site staff attorney. Caring Unlimited is very lucky in that capacity to help with civil legal matters and divorce, parental rights and responsibilities, protection orders. But many of the programs partner with or connect with legal representation opportunities and options at low cost or no cost, depending on the situation. But all of the programs do have court advocacy support or legal advocacy support in some capacity. These are advocates that are specially trained to help with civil legal matters primarily, to help provide advocacy and support for victims who are navigating that parental rights and responsibilities process, or predominantly the protection from abuse order process. Some of the programs have some liaisons with the criminal legal process in particular. Our member program down in Cumberland County in particular has some connections with local law enforcement and some pretty enhanced programming when it comes to criminal response. Not all the programs have that necessarily, but all of the programs at some point bump up against the criminal legal system and are providing advocacy services to victims who are navigating a criminal process because of the choices of their abuser. And then So these are some of the other programs like training and collaboration, various initiatives that we're doing here. And then I also wanted to mention, I appreciate you bringing this up, Allison. So MCEDV is the statewide like traditional member coalition that provides support and services for victims of domestic abuse and violence in Maine. But there's also the Wabanaki Women's Coalition. The Wabanaki, oh, it looks like Regina is responding to this right as I'm speaking about it, but I'm happy to keep chatting about it briefly. And so, yeah, as Regina mentioned on the actual map, there is the contact information for the Wabanaki Women's Coalition and their member programs. So for those of you who don't know, the Wabanaki Women's Coalition is the statewide joint domestic violence and sexual assault coalition that provides support and technical assistance to 5 DV, domestic violence and SA, sexual assault member programs that provide very similar supports that the non-tribal programs provide to not just victims of, not just tribal citizens that are victims, but they do also, they will and do also provide support for non-tribal citizens, but they are primarily there to provide support for tribal citizens and have that sort of cultural specific lens. We're very lucky that we do have the Wabanaki Women's Coalition and a tribal specific coalition in Maine. Not all states do have that. So thinking about time, I just want to also point out too, when we think about the work of domestic violence advocates and MCEDV, you know, one important thing for you all to understand is that DV advocates and victim witness advocates have very similar often goals, one of which is providing survivors with accurate information and helping them to identify, you know, best options that they feel will keep them the safest emotionally, physically, and financially. We also know that many survivors will not engage with the criminal legal system beyond the initial 911 call as a conduit for safety. However, for those that do, VWAs play a critical role. Your ability to accurately explain, you know, the complicated criminal case process, because it is and can feel complicated, and to be a go-between with the prosecutors or the prosecution is really critical for victims to feel heard, understood, and to make informed decisions. You know, I talked about accurate information on the list of safety planning earlier, and it is such a powerful and safety enhancing thing to have accurate information to be able to make informed decisions. Accurate information helps give victims some semblance of agency and choice, something that their abusers have frankly taken away from them. And so your ability to be able to accurately and calmly describe what a victim can expect to happen, right, in a trauma-informed way, being really transparent about the process and the limitations of the process, is something that we have found value in and have seen value in whenever VWAs operate in that capacity. So again, very similar, there's many parts of our work are in alignment where there are similar goals, and then there are points of departure. I would say that many of the DVRCs have a wider and more flexible mandate than the DA's office, which focuses on criminal legal matters. And as I've mentioned, these are the many services that that DV advocates or DVRCs are able to provide. They're often, you know, able to meet survivors' needs beyond those of a criminal case and do regularly in all of these various ways. And so when we think about this sort of trauma-informed coordinated community response, we want you to be connected with your local program to help ensure that, you know, the victims that we may be collectively working with have opportunities to explore additional safety enhancing options that the DVRCs may be able to help them identify and connect them to. And similarly, when we have questions about a criminal case or a criminal legal process, being able to connect and say, what's the next step in this? This victim wants to engage in this process. They've given us permission to share this information. It can be really critical. I want to take just a quick a moment to talk before we end about some of the confidentiality differences and considerations before we end. These are some ways that you can make that referral to a DVRC in case you haven't already done that, depending on whatever capacity you're working in. But to be very clear, similar to what Mikasa shared, they have the same. in the last session on sort of sexual violence 101, DVRCs have very specific confidentiality requirements that they have to adhere to. DV advocates cannot violate non-disclosure laws except in situations where child abuse or abuse of an incapacitated older adult is known or suspected. But beyond that, what survivors share with advocates is completely confidential unless, right, the advocate obtains a written release of information. That ROI should be time limited, and the survivor should understand who will receive the information and how it will be used. It's also important for you to understand the limitations of our ability to share this information and the important reasons for why there are limits. The Violence Against Women Act, excuse me, really did identify that there was a unique need for community-based advocacy services to have this flexibility in what we're able to provide for victims. And so if you want have any questions about the specifics of that provision, I can point you in that direction. But sometimes we may not be able to share things with you that you're able to share with us. And these are the reasons for why that is. If anybody has any questions about this or connecting with the DVRC, feel free I'll open it up to chat or for conversation now for the last couple of minutes. Regina's also going to pop in the chat a link to an evaluation that we would really hope that you take a few minutes to fill out so that we can get your feedback on how effective this session has been and areas for improvement. I'll stop sharing now and ask you all to weigh in on anything that you've heard. Turn it over to you, Kara, whatever works.
Sure. Thank you so much, Kelly and Regina. And thank you all for coming today and joining in to participate, because it makes the learning richer for all of us. Anyone want to chime in with questions? We're coming up on lunchtime, which tends to overwhelm the questions. Well, folks know how to find you all as well. And you've put some great resources out here too. So thank you again for your time, for your energy, for your enthusiasm, for helping to bridge these connections. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Kara. Thanks all. And I've just popped in my and Regina's email into the chat in case you do have any questions that you can't think of right now because you're hungry and you want to circle back later. We're happy to do that.